Hey, what's up, tribe? Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the TFC Audio Project Down Under. This week, I chat with Clare Wakefield, who is a clinical naturopath and TFC foot nerd based in Melbourne. Clare has a background in movement and rehabilitative personal training, as well as holistic lifestyle coaching. She helps people integrate the principles of natural living and holistic health through her business, Natural Body Lab, which you can find on Instagram at Natural Body Lab. In this episode, we talk through the fundamentals of good food, how you can tell if your nutritional needs are being met, the importance of preparing, cooking, and sharing your meals, and some simple strategies for improving digestion. This episode is brought to you by TFC Events. We'll be jetting down to Melbourne next weekend for our Feet, Balance and Play workshop, as well as a natural running workshop, which will both be held at CrossFit Soul Rebel in Thornbury. Tickets are still available for both, and you can check out all the details in the events tab on our website. We also have an upcoming workshop and seminar tour through Hobart, Adelaide and Perth, which will be from the end of May through the start of June, so stay tuned for announcements of the dates and locations for those. All right, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Clare.
Hey.
So we're steadily getting through basically all the pillars of health and the different aspects of our philosophy. And obviously food is such a major pillar of health that I'm very interested in, and I'm a big lover of food as well, but it's not my area of expertise per se. So I figured it'd be great to get someone on to chat who does know food inside out, and couldn't think of a better person than you.
Thank you. Look, yeah, we all love food, but yeah, I
Yes.
feel it's look, it's a pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I thought we could just delve right in and start with, I guess, a bit of a background and history of your journey with food. So I know obviously there'd be a personal journey and a professional journey, and I imagine that would overlap a fair bit.
Yeah.
And yeah, just where did your journey with food start?
Yeah, no, you're right. And when people ask me where the food thing came from, it probably has three pillars, if you like. And the first one was just growing up in a family who loved to cook. And, my mom, my grandmother, we always had, it was always fun. It was always that beautiful community sort of spirit around the table. So there was always that aspect to it. And we always had home cooked meals. And I had a grandfather who had a veggie garden. So, there was always that around me. And then when I was maybe a little bit older, probably 6, 7, 8, I don't know who will actually know of this guy, but there used to be a guy on TV. He was an ex-Vietnam veteran, Les Hiddens, and he's known as the Bush Tucker Man. And I've never watched TV in my life, but 6:30 every Friday night, I used to be glued to watching this TV show because he would go through the outback and he would teach people about Bush Tucker and food. And, he used to train the army, the army soldiers to do that. So I was fascinated from that aspect as well. And it just became this natural evolution. And then as I got a little bit older, I think my mum took me to a naturopath when I was maybe 10, a little bit later on. And, it just sort of all came together, and I started seeing that food could be used for other things, not just, the pleasure and survival in the food, but actually for healing as well. So it's always been in me.
Yeah, wow. Oh, I wish I had the Bush Tucker Man when I was growing up, or
He's,
maybe I just missed him. I don't know how long he was on for, but
yeah, look, he's still around. There's a big
oh,
revival thing at the moment. Yeah, so I think
oh,
there's actually a program around it at the moment. But I'll link you
oh,
in.
cool.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
pretty
link me
cool.
in, and maybe we can put it in the show notes as well for people listening.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
and so, what about then your sort of professional? So obviously, you went to a naturopath when you were 10,
Yeah.
and that would have been your first experience with food as medicine.
Yeah. Look, from a health perspective, I had a few things going on as a child. I was born with my sort of functional my legs in a sort of funny position, and for that reason, I was in a lot of pain. But I also had a lot of skin conditions as well. So there's a few things going on, and
Mm,
Western medicine was quite limited in the way that it could help.
yeah.
So the naturopath sort of was my mum's next point of call, and I got so much more relief from some of the things there. And I'm not saying that one's better than the other, but for me in particular, that it worked. So that sort of opened up my line there. And then when I went back through work experience, maybe 3 years later, I went back to that same naturopath, and she actually ended up employing me. So I've done it
Oh,
ever since, literally.
wow. Comes full circle. And so
Yeah.
does that so from your experience with that naturopath, is that sort of what made you think, "Oh, I really wanna go down a career path with food or naturopathy or down this line?" Or
Yeah.
did you
Yeah.
sort of
Look,
go straight into that or
um, very, very, very temporarily, like 2 week temporarily, at the end of year 12, I actually started doing a forensic science degree at one of the universities here. And I can't
Oh,
remember what the linchpin on that was, but literally I sort of came home and I thought, this is ridiculous. Like, I'm not even sure. Like, I love that aspect of sort of investigating and going down that route. But at the same time, I thought, no, if I'm going to be really happy doing, whatever it is for the rest of my life, I just want to do what I do naturally. And it's always been food, and it's always been sort of being outdoors and that sort of stuff as well. So, you know, drawing on my experience and my work experience and my working sort of teenage years with the naturopath, it just became this natural evolution, and I've never looked back.
yeah, and I imagine it'd be pretty, quite rewarding, having experienced that as a child and found a lot of benefit, and then to be able to
Yeah.
do the same thing with clients,
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. It's a really strange thing when you sort of get literally the mirror of what happened to you, walk through the clinic as a little child. You actually get to say, I can fix this before it snowballs into what happened to me. So, it's a really,
yeah.
yeah, it's a really rewarding thing. I love it. And I guess there's also the element of the forensic science in there as well. I feel like a forensic investigator constantly.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess with all aspects of health, you do have to take that sort of
100%.
investigative, scientific approach of just
Yeah.
because the human body is so complex, we never really know exactly what's going on, and we can sort of take some pretty good educated guesses, but a lot of it just comes down to tinkering and playing with different variables,
Yeah, exactly,
and
exactly, and
and sort
just
of
and
figuring out,
observe observation.
yeah, and figuring out what
Yeah,
works for the individual because there's obviously one person is going to respond differently to a certain dietary or supplement or anything like that compared to someone else in a different context, and I feel like the
yeah,
world of food is so opinionated in terms of people think, oh, it's you got to do it this way, or everyone should eat this way, or you got to have this XYZ supplement and everything. But really, when it comes down to it, it's all individual, and a
yeah,
big thing would be
yeah.
personalization. Have you found that a lot in your own practice?
Hugely, hugely. So, I guess that's the difference, and that's what I am constantly explaining in practice, that the difference between, say, a Western modality where it is very symptom based. So though it's obviously very diagnostic, and the protocols or the treatment protocols are all wrapped around that symptom.
Mm.
If I had 10 people come in with the same set of symptoms, or sorry, if I had 10 people come in with, say, endometriosis, for example, which is a set of symptoms, really, when you think about it, every one of those women could have potentially had it for different reasons. So you really have to turn it
Yeah.
around and go, right, let's look at you as an individual. Let's get rid of the diagnosis and the names and just kind of go, right, where is it that we need to tap in? It's very patient centered compared to the symptom model.
Yeah, and I've found that especially well, obviously in my own experiences with physiotherapy and the same thing where we get in university we get taught a bunch of different diagnoses and conditions and how to manage that condition, and when you get out into the real world, I suppose, then first of all, no one really presents exactly like a textbook expects them to present, and then second of all, yeah, there's a lot of different, well, infinite different factors that would go on with that individual to create that specific set of musculoskeletal symptoms, and sometimes it's more simple, and sometimes it's a lot more complex, obviously, but you do have to really tailor it to the individual, and I do love the I guess analogies or the similarities between food and movement in that sense of needing quantity, quality, variety, and in certain contexts at certain times and so on. And
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
it's
I
like
feel like
my
too when it's what. Sorry.
sorry, you go.
No, I was
Classic
going to say I
Zen.
feel like too when it's when it's patient centered like that and tailored to the person, you know, I think you get faster results, but also I think it's a lot more. Sounds like a cliche word, but I feel like it's a lot more empowering too to the client, because they actually understand. They get a chance to understand how it is they got down that path and what it is we need to do to reverse engineer it. It's not like it becomes, you know, it's a little bit more of a chance for them to get intimate with themselves and actually understand what their habits are doing and,
Yeah.
you know, where it takes them.
Yeah. And I really love that personalized, individualized client approach. And obviously that's very important when you are working with one-on-one with someone. But at the same time, what I've found in my own practice and I guess with the work that I've been doing with the Foot Collective is that when you do take that bird's eye view on the population, you can see certain things that not everyone, but the majority of people are missing in terms of their movement health. And, you know, they might be trying these specific exercises and we, you know, you could call them supplemental exercises or supplemental movements, but they're still missing the bigger picture of their overall movement diet, so to speak, which we've talked about in a previous podcast. And I guess that leads me into wondering what you feel are sort of the basics of food or the basics that most people are missing, that even if they weren't getting individualized or personalized advice, that everyone should be hitting these
Yeah.
basics that would sort of cover, or that would get them maybe 80%, 90% of the results.
Yeah, I think great question. And I think the thing with food is that, you know, well, I suppose it's the same as everything these days. It is so governed by marketing. And the one thing I do want to say first is that, you know, I have full respect for everybody's preferences for diet. Like I would sort of take a step back from that. I don't have a personal preference across the board. But the one thing I will say is that I find with things like social media, the people, for example, who it's just coming to mind. So this isn't the people who might be jumping up and down for paleo or for vegan or for carnivore or whatever it is. I've got no bias, but if they're jumping up and down on social media saying it's working for me, it's working for me, I can pretty much guarantee you that there's going to be a handful of people in the back stalls who it doesn't work for. And, you know, unfortunately, they're the ones who won't stand up on social media and say these things because intrinsically they just feel like they're failing. You know, so it's really it starts to shape a real bias on social media and, you know, on some of these platforms, because all you see is success. And so you think that, you know, if that doesn't fit you, then you're failing. And it's pretty sad to see. But as for, you know, my general sort of ideas around food, I think the important thing is that the big thing that I say to everybody is eat as much whole food as you possibly can. Now, I know that sounds like an ideal, and it can be a journey. So you don't have to go out and, you know, throw everything out tomorrow, which would be great. But at the same time, starting to incorporate more fresh foods across the board and eating a really wide variety of foods is the better way to do it. Because the other thing that I find that a lot of people do is we tend to, we're habitual. You know, you tend to do, if people do, say, for example, a weekly shop, they tend to buy the same thing, especially busy people. They'll buy the same thing because they're in and out and they know it. And that can start to generate deficiencies in itself. So, but as for sort of looking at the actual nutrition side of things, like I said, the first thing I always say is just try and eat as many whole foods as you possibly can. That'll probably get you about 80% of the way. Having really big dietary restrictions, so let's, you know, for example, vegan, I have no problem with that, but at the same time, you still need to just make sure that, you know, the things like the macros are covered. And, you know, I think everyone these days is really aware of things like protein, the importance of your macros, your protein, your fat. Carbohydrates is fairly controversial these days, but I really think if you're going to live a long-term healthful life, then you really need to incorporate those things and also have as many colours on your plate as you can. You know, so I know that's really basic, so I don't know how much more you want me to sort of go into that, but they're the things that I tend to say start there.
Yeah, and I think that even just the real food, the whole food thing is obviously very important. And what you mentioned about obviously there's, you know, thousands and thousands of people jumping up and down on social media saying vegans the best, vegans, you know, works for me. And then there's thousands of people jumping up and down saying carnivore is the best and everything works for me. And like you said, you don't have a particular bias as long as it is actually working for you. But I think maybe where things can, and I always like to bring it back to a movement analogy, obviously, because that's how my brain works. But, you know, if someone identifies, say, as a yogi, or like, yeah, I'm a yogi and yoga is awesome and I love it and it works for me. But as soon as you start to identify with a certain, say, diet or movement modality, and you start to only do that, and you see that as this is going to be your lifelong thing, and then, you know, you sort of get into this rigid pattern where you do open yourself up to deficiencies. So a yogi might end up deficient in pulling strength, or, you know, aerobic fitness, or different things like this, because they don't have that enough variability. But if they identify as only a yogi, then that sort of limits them from exploring other movement things. So if someone identifies as a vegan, like, obviously there will be certain, or there may be certain times in someone's life where they should be only eating plants and a, you know, wide variety of raw plants. But then there might also be times in another person's life, or even in that same person's life, where they should be eating mostly animal foods for different reasons. And I think having that fluidity and that flexibility to be able to not identify with a certain diet or movement or whatever, and to be able to really take an analytical look at what is actually working for you, and are you meeting your body's needs.
Great call. I agree.
Yeah.
I think it's really important. One thing I try and teach people is, you know, the difference between extrinsic cues and intrinsic cues, for that exact reason. You know, it's a bit like, going back to your movement analogy, it's a bit like, you know, making sure that you're following your gym timetable or your training timetable, even if you're tired and depleted. You know, you're probably going to do more harm to your adrenals and, you know, your body than you are good. So with respect to food, I tend to I like to think everything in nature is cyclic. So I tend to try and relate it to that. And I feel like, you know, unless you're lucky enough to live on the equator, which I know some of you do, you know, we get that seasonal fluctuation. And with that seasonal fluctuation, you always have higher or lower needs of certain nutrients. Now, some of them can be stored in the body, some of them can't. But even metabolically, you know, we tend to shift gears as that cycle sort of changes and the weather cycle sort of changes. So yeah, cueing into your intrinsic cues and actually going, am I depleted? Do I need more nutrition from certain areas? That's probably the most important thing you can do.
Mm-hmm. And so what would be, like, if you could have a top 1, 2, or 3 intrinsic and extrinsic cues to look at for people listening, what would you recommend?
Oh, by far and large, I would say the front runner would be fatigue. You know, energy levels and fatigue. And I feel like, sorry, wow, I just had a really big wedge-tail eagle just come straight up.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a sign.
An omen, a good omen, hopefully.
Yeah. Oh, I hope my dog's not in the backyard. It's okay. It's all right. Sorry. Energy, definitely energy. And I find that, you know, of course, there's other factors with that, you know, obviously movement, sleep, emotional status, all of that sort of stuff. But if you're not, you know, if your energy is starting to fail, or if it's starting to fluctuate or, drop, then, you know, there's a chance that that's, you know, in terms of nutrition, you may need to look at bumping up, just for example, things like, you know, some of your nutrients, like your B vitamins or your protein levels even, you know. And things like, on the other end of that spectrum, sleep, quality of sleep is actually quite often, it's driven by things like blood sugar fluctuations or insulin resistance or things like that. So, you know, if your sleep is not as sound as you'd like it to be, again, there's all of those other extrinsic factors like, you know, stress levels and that sort of stuff. But your food and your nutrients or your nutrition is definitely something that you need to make all of those, you know, wonderful serotonin, melatonin, everything in the brain. And also recovery from anything. Sorry, my head's just exploding. Now I'm like, okay, so what about your skin and your hair and all of the, blah, blah, blah.
well,
Sorry.
well, that would be, I guess, that'd be the extrinsic factors. So
Yeah.
intrinsically, energy, sleep, and
I think
recovery. That
recovery,
that makes a lot.
yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Which, I mean, when you think about it, those three are probably, they're quite interlaced anyway. But even
Yeah.
things like feeling the cold,
Oh, okay.
metabolically, if you're not firing properly, then, yes, again, it could be emotions, it could be sleep. This is why I
Mm,
love the Foot Collective and the way that all of these things are brought together.
yeah.
But yeah, it could very much be food as well. You might be lacking
Mm,
certain nutrients in terms of just that vitality.
yeah. Yeah. And I think those three things I've certainly noticed in myself, especially energy and sleep, and where when I am eating really well and obviously moving and sleeping and all the other pillars. But I just have this overwhelming energy, like I'm on 3 cups of coffee, all day, except without any jitters, just super clear, like some weird energy drugs. But it's just, and this is when I'm not having coffee or only having like, very, very limited amount of
Yeah,
caffeine.
yeah,
And you really feel this like, whoa, this is what energy feels like. This is what good energy feels like. And then conversely, I'll notice when, if I have been having a few too many treats or like just not eating the level of quality food that I would like, then I will notice that I don't get that sort of all day energy. And I think an issue, I guess that's been really good for me to experience both ends of that spectrum, because I'll know now, okay, well, this is how I sort of should, quote unquote, should be feeling or want to be feeling. And now I can compare how I am feeling to that. Although I think a lot of people probably don't know how good or how energetic they could really be feeling. And so do you think some people's sort of baseline for
yeah,
their energy is a lot lower than it should be, and so they don't actually notice that they're really low energy? They just think that's normal for them?
yeah, 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 absolutely. So a couple of things. I feel like, yeah, you're right. A lot of people sort of get, they fall into a lane, and that just becomes their life. In
Mm-hmm.
particular, I find that with women. I mean, don't get me wrong. I know that men go through this as well, but I find it in particular with mums. And I think it comes from it's a point of relativity. So if you haven't had any sleep because you've had young children and stuff like that in the house, and all of a sudden you then go and get 3 or 4 hours solid sleep because baby's finally sleeping through, you feel like Wonder Woman, and that's your new
Mm-hmm.
norm. But the other thing that people are doing, once they're in that lane and it becomes normal, they're then propping themselves up with those stimulants, with caffeine, with sugar, with whatever it is. And you're right, there's this huge difference between that buzz of a stimulant and that real clean, sort of, really
Mm.
good quality energy. And the difference, obviously, is you don't crash down from one of them, but
Yeah.
people don't understand the difference, because they
Yeah.
haven't necessarily let themselves be in that
Yeah.
lane.
I've found that a lot because, well, when so if I'm particularly sensitive to caffeine, which is why I do try to limit it. But I'll notice if I'm going down not a spiral, but like it can become quite a negative cycle where it's like, oh, I'm not feeling as energetic as I would like, maybe because I haven't slept as well as I'd like, and so I have maybe an extra coffee, and then that sort of simulates what the energy I want is, but not quite there.
Yeah,
And then, but having that extra coffee means my sleep is disrupted for that night because I'm extra sensitive to caffeine. And then the next day I wake up even worse, and then I'm more likely to want that second coffee. And then, yeah, it becomes that spiral. And I'll also notice if I'm underslept and over caffeinated, then I'm reaching for more high carb, sugary foods and wanting more snacks
chocolate in
and
the
all of
afternoon.
that stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. And it's just very interesting to witness that in myself, even though I'm someone who's been across these healthy habits for a long time. It's very not very easy, but it's very possible to fall into that, and then it's a matter of catching yourself and figuring out where you can break that cycle, or what's the linchpin that you can break that cycle with, and then you can
yeah,
bring yourself back into
yeah.
a more positive loop.
Yeah, you're right, and that is probably one of the most common loops that the first thing you have to deal with in my line of work in clinic is usually that, because
Mm,
you sort of people end up on that mouse wheel, but then because they're on that mouse wheel, they become they don't realize how depleted they are because they're propped up on stimulants the whole time. And so,
mm,
in order to actually get into that, rather than trying to put something in over the top and mask the symptoms, and medicate it, if you like, you really have to try and get in there and go, no, 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 let's just take all of that away and see what the body's actually doing. Because then you have to almost start the conversation with yourself and go, how tired are you really? Like, do
mm.
we need to sort of get rid of the stimulants, or, you probably do need a lot more sleep. When you'd be surprised how many people come in and sort of go, no, 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 I'm fine. I've got all the energy in the world. And you can see that they're a nervous wreck. Because, or they've developed pain, fibromyalgia, all of these different
Mm.
things because they're just in this huge nervous system loop, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. And it's sort of once you get a taste of that positive loop where, where for me a lot of it does come down to making sure my sleep is good, and part of that is like severely limiting caffeine. And then once that's going well, I just really don't find I crave I only want healthy food that I know will make me feel good, and I
Yeah,
don't crave
yeah,
the stuff that then makes me
nailed
crave more and so on.
it.
Yeah. And so
Yeah,
so that
exactly,
energy
exactly.
that energy is such a really big thing, and a lot of it just comes down to really analyzing. Like, if I think maybe for people to reference is that if you are eating really well, and if you do have most of these pillars of health, you're on top of it, then you should really have that all day clean energy without needing stimulants, and you should be waking up feeling refreshed without feeling like you need coffee. Basically, we talked about that in the sleep podcast
Yeah,
last week, and that's sort of my measure of whether or not I'm sleeping well enough. But really, it's a measure of how your overall health and vitality is whether you wake up feeling refreshed, like you've had enough sleep, and you have all day energy, and without sort of big slumps, and you get to sleep fine that night. Do you think that would that be a
yeah,
fair
well,
sort of? I
yeah,
guess maybe
yeah,
not a.
yeah,
I guess a
definitely,
target. It's
definitely.
not necessarily realistic for everyone to get that immediately, but something to work towards.
I feel like a couple of tips with respect to sort of trying to break that cycle is making sure that you're eating enough dietary fat through the day, because
Mm,
that's where we build our adrenal hormones from, and it also it actually stops, well, it slows our not metabolism, digestion down a little bit,
mm,
and it stops those insulin and blood sugar fluctuations. But the other thing I always try and get people or encourage people to go towards is eating, including more magnesium, whether it's foods or supplements if you want to, but foods into your diet. Because
mm,
if, magnesium really gives you, I don't know if you ever did chemistry at school, but magnesium, like when it hits water, it's just, it's combustible basically. You get that energy. And that's pretty much what magnesium does in the body as well. Yes, it relaxes things, et cetera, but it actually helps, with nerves and all sorts of stuff as well. So what by putting magnesium foods into the diet and a bit more fat, and then trying to get off the caffeine wheel, yeah, giving yourself better quality sleep is the number one thing there, because it's not so much about trying to keep you in the lane that you want to stay in or that you think you want to stay in. It's about replenishing you properly at that bottom part of that daily cycle, so that you do wake up into that sort of that cleaner energy, if you want to call it that, into that better and more refreshed state.
yeah.
The other thing that, when I say magnesium foods, I always try and maybe say to people, this is probably why we crave chocolate and cacao and that sort of stuff as well, because it is particularly high in magnesium. So you're sort
Mm,
of going for that sugar and that stimulant hit, but intrinsically, I think our body's also looking for, what caffeine will also deplete your body of magnesium. So it's sort of like if you try and taper down one and increase the other, it does actually help.
all right. So I should be swapping a morning coffee for a morning cacao,
Yeah, definitely.
maybe. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah.
I'm actually I'm about to go into a. I do really like my coffee. I know that I sleep better without any, and I know that I can get away with one a day. But I'm gonna have a break because it's sort of been creeping back in a little too much lately, and so I'm gonna have a week off. And I was like, oh, what can I replace it with? Because I love that hot drink in the morning, especially it's getting colder. I mean, Brisbane cold isn't very cold, but for us, it's getting colder up here.
Yeah.
And I love that sort of ritual of a hot drink in the morning. So a cacao would probably be a really good option there. Hey,
Yeah. Yeah,
for my
definitely.
magnesium.
Definitely.
Sweet.
Yeah. Yeah, it's look, people, I just don't think people realize that caffeine is a drug, and it is the
Yeah,
most
that's true.
socially accepted drug in the world,
And people
and
are just
being,
lining up.
well, down here in Melbourne, it's like it's coffee mecca, it's coffee,
Yeah.
coffee capital, and it's just the norm. It's if you can try and detach the actual social aspect of that, which usually is what gets people going. It's the ritual, as you've just said. It's that it's the ritual of morning, or it's the ritual of going and catching up with someone. It's a coffee. If you can try and even stick to the ritual, so you're not freaking your nervous system out too much, but actually just replace what it is that you put into your mouth, then give it a month and you'll find that you don't crave it anymore.
Yeah. It is always the way where, and I've found it again and again in my life, where you think, oh, I couldn't possibly go without that X, couldn't possibly go without X,
Yeah,
coffee,
yeah,
cheese, whatever it is, and then you spend a month without it, and you're like, oh, I really don't miss it that much.
yeah.
And it
Look,
might be nice
it's
to have here
amazing.
and there, but yeah, you
It's
can really
amazing what
break the
these things can
cycle.
do when they bind into those receptors. Hence the word
Yeah.
drug.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's the I guess the intrinsic feelings of what you can get to have a measure of what your nutrition and food quality is like. And what about the extrinsic factors that you mentioned briefly before?
So yeah, things like, the first thing that the quality of people's skin, and I mean, don't get me wrong, there's other factors in that as well, like there is with all of it. But things like skin, even things like your I was going to say metabolism, but even to a point, body composition.
Hmm.
I don't. I'm not. I'm trying really hard not to sound like I'm straight down the line here with because body diversity is a thing, and it should be a thing. But at the same time, I tend to find people who go for a whole food type diet and vary it and just have a more natural style diet, they often don't have issues with body composition. They don't have issues with weight or with skin or with things like that, because everything that they actually put in their mouth is sort of pointing the needle towards a positive change, as opposed to, or healing, if you like, or good composition, as opposed to, it becomes very hard to overeat natural foods or whole foods, very
For
hard,
sure. Yeah.
because of the fat, not the fat content, but more so the fiber content and things like that. It fills us up.
Yeah. Yeah, you just don't find that you need as much. I know for sure for me, I was gonna say this before as well, with the, like you were saying, with the fat throughout the day, but I found as soon as I have some kind of sugary or very high carb thing during the day, then I'll just be wanting more throughout the day. Like my
Yeah,
brain is just sort of searching for it. Whereas if I don't have it and I fill up more on fat, and then I have more of like the carby sort of sweet potato, rice, things like that at night, then I'm sort of, that's good for me. I'm done for the day, and I feel like satisfied that I've had some carbs, that because carbs are great in certain contexts, and especially if you're moving a lot and doing a lot of strength training and things like that, then they can be particularly helpful.
yeah,
And I think from my understanding, it can also help with sleep, and that's one of the problems with low
yeah,
carb diets is
correct.
can you explain a bit about that actually?
So there's a couple of avenues with that. The first one is that the sweet potato and things like that. So the more complex. And before I say that, I want to be clear that we're not talking about breads and pastas and refined carbohydrates.
Yeah.
Sleep, the carbohydrate forms that actually help or are conducive to good sleep are the more complex carbohydrates. So fruits, root vegetables, whole grains and things like that. So there's a couple of things. The first one is that they contain a lot of what we call prebiotic fiber. So they literally help to feed our gut flora. And that, that's pretty much where we make our serotonin, which is then moved up to the brain, and it's then converted to melatonin, which is our sleep hormone. So, carbohydrates do feed and fuel our gut flora to make all of those really good, nutrients. And there's also, in the complex carbohydrate foods, there's also the B vitamins and the bits and pieces that you actually need to make some of those neuroendocrines. The other side to that is that the slow release carbohydrates actually helps to modulate your cortisol production. So it actually reduces your cortisol production. And you need, obviously, that as the day goes on. 6 a.m. it should be peaking, and then it starts to drop off as you go through the day. Now, if you had low carbohydrate diet, then that actually it's more conducive to spiking cortisol. Okay, so you don't actually get that drop off at night. So it can actually, and it's got to do with insulin. Insulin and cortisol sort of have a very close relationship. So if you're on the flip side of things, if you're having refined carbohydrates, then that can spike your sugars, and you can get that insulin sort of effect, and that can mess with our sleep. But on the other side of it, you don't get that drop off, or you don't get that suppression of cortisol if you're not having complex carbohydrates. So when I work with people, I do exactly what you're talking about most of the time, depending on the person, obviously. But generally speaking, I always do say, more protein and stuff like that, all the bigger meals, probably in the morning. And then if you're going to have complex carbohydrates, usually the timing is good at nighttime to do that for that reason. It just helps to settle the nervous system down from a few angles.
Yeah. Cool. And I realized I just segued pretty hard from the body composition to that, but I'm gonna sort of tie it all back in. So something that I've come across in, I guess, through my readings and research and some of the courses I've done, is the concept that different people with different body types, like say mesomorph, endomorph, ectomorph, will do better with certain types, say ectomorphs, will do better with more higher carb, and certain types like endomorph will do better with lower carbs in general. And obviously there'll be a lot of personalization within each of that. Have you found that in your practice, or have you found, I guess that ties in with the body composition too, because an endomorph can't really hope to be looking like an ectomorph, but they a certain body composition for that body type, like you should be healthy for your type rather than healthy for just skinny, or healthy for just muscular, or whatever.
I'm going to be really honest and say, in terms of the ecto, meso, and endomorph, I actually haven't worked with that for a lot of years. Okay. I know I'm well aware of them. I'm just trying to actually join the dots, because for myself, when I work in practice, if I've got somebody who comes in who's, say, a classic endomorph, or I'm even looking more at where they're distributing. So if you've got, it's a good example. If you've got the classic pear-shaped woman who is sort of larger in the thighs and in the bum and that sort of stuff, then I personally tend to find that that's more to do with liver and hormonally driven things. So that's when I start to look more at manipulating the diet and just making sure that things like as I said, the hormones are balanced, and then the liver and that sort of stuff are actually functioning properly. I'm just trying to tie that in with an actual endomorph in terms of macros. I'm not even sure I can answer that, to be honest. I don't think I could. But when you say eating right for your type, I mean, obviously that's so important. And if you've got somebody who actually walks in, with a certain body shape, there is a whole lot of education around that. You can't necessarily, it's almost pushing against, well, it is pushing against nature to a point, to be able to sort of go, no, that's not necessarily realistic for you. That's probably going to push you into an unhealthy space, to try and do that. And eating right for your type is very much a healthy thing to do.
Yeah, cool. And I guess So that would be the extrinsic factors or the external factors that you can look for is body composition, skin health. Obviously, if you're coming up with certain skin conditions or acne or things like that, and I think you mentioned hair health as well. Are there any other extrinsic factors that you'd recommend looking at?
Good question. Yeah, so look, I think skin's a really big one. And so obviously, and your nails being an extension of your skin, so your fingernails can actually often tell you things like mineral deficiencies and signs.
Mm.
Um, you know, there is like even just I suppose the quality of these types of things. And when I say these types of things, if you've got, for example, the vertical ridges in your nails, for example,
Yeah.
it's pretty well documented that there's some potential digestive issues there, and some, I'm going to use the word mineral deficiencies, but quite often it's not that they're not eating it; it's just that they're not absorbing it. It's got more to do with what's going on down here, as opposed to you can eat the most perfect diet in the world, and it doesn't mean you're absorbing it.
Mm.
So nails, skin. In Chinese medicine, they use things like the color of your tongue or also your gums. So really, I think any of these sort of physical expressions, you know, most of us can look at somebody and go, "Yeah, you're really unhealthy," or "Wow, something's not right there." Most of us can
Yeah.
cue that in, if you know what I mean.
And conversely, you can really tell if someone's vibrantly healthy. Hey.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So
Yeah.
yeah, and that whole phrase, "You are what you eat," well, you are what you eat and what you do. So,
Yes.
you just can't go past it.
Yeah. And you hinted at a couple things there where you said you could be eating the perfect diet in the world, but if depending on whether or not you're absorbing it, then that'll change a lot as to how healthy you are and what you get
Yeah.
from that diet. Um, and so I guess that comes into the whole concept of digestion. And yes, you might be eating the best foods, but if you're in a I'll just let's chat about digestion and
Yeah,
how
sure,
maybe
sure,
stress
sure.
might affect digestion or and all of that. Well,
Hugely,
what factors
hugely.
would
So
affect it?
yeah, so the number one thing that I think affects people's digestion is definitely it's cortisol. It's so cortisol being your stress hormone. And, so when you dive into things like chronic stress, I mean, can be really healthy in short snippets. We've got this beautiful stress response for a reason. But when it starts to become chronic or long term, then that's when you've got a problem. And, to try and simplify it, basically, if you're in fight or flight all of the time, your your sympathetic nervous system will shunt all of the blood and everything into everything you need in an emergency, which is obviously, heart rate, muscles, everything that you getting poised to run or fight or whatever it is. And the two things that tend to go out the window when you're in that chronic state are your digestion and your hormones, also like your reproductive hormones. But the digestion, chronic stress is a huge one for that. And whenever I'm working with anybody who has got digestive issues, and whether it's, this week I'm dealing with colitis or IBS quite a lot. And the first thing I always do is look at their stress response, because you can do whatever you want to do to the gut or manipulate the diet. But if you've got this waterfall of stress and, that sort of stuff going on, then you're never really going to get over the line.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even things like food sensitivities and allergies and things like that quite often will come down to the stress response. I think it's really only coming out now how important a factor that is, that, within the rest, in terms of allergies or anything else, you have to get the nervous system on deck first, and then you get the digestive system on deck.
Yeah, and we explored stress fairly deeply. I think it was a couple of episodes ago, and we talked about how it is so closely linked with all of these different issues, chronic stress, but that it gets a bad rap because stress can be very, very helpful in the right
Yeah.
context.
Yep.
But we talked about when your stress response is activated, it's fight or flight, which is sympathetic nervous system, which you've just mentioned, and which is literally the opposite of rest and digest, which is the parasympathetic nervous system.
Yeah.
And so what kind of, obviously in some cases, removing a stressful stimulus, I suppose, is needed, or getting out of a toxic relationship or a toxic workplace or something like that is stressing you out. But what kind of
Yeah.
strategies have you found most helpful with clients for improving a stress response, or some kind of strategies that you would use with clients around their eating to improve their digestion from a stress point of view?
Good question. So I guess purely from the stress point of view, I mean, it really depends on the person and what they're going to find enjoyable, because it has to be, you don't want it to be work for them, because again, that's just pretending, and it's going to create that stress response.
Yeah.
But I think initially good old breath work, or good old, just slowing down where you can. And what we were saying before, there's so many people that get caught up in the fast lane, and they just don't realize it. They don't realize how on they are until you educate them to try and pull out those stimulants, or find the linchpin there, and actually get them back down to base. So in terms of doing that, as I said, breath work, literally slowing down when you're eating, and actually making time for a meal or time to eat, rather than eating, say, on the go while you're on the computer or while you're doing something else, because you're going to have that background sort of generation of cortisol and stress, and multitasking, it activates that. So being mindful and just chewing a little bit more slowly, and good old chewing is the start of our digestion, and it's really underrated, but it works really well.
Yeah.
Just in terms of breaking things down. But moving sort of down into the stomach, making sure that from a digestive point of view, if you're somebody who is chronically stressed and you can't necessarily remove the extrinsic, the stressors at the time, then slowing down, making time for your meal, and then maybe considering things like digestives. We would call them digestives. So good old apple cider vinegar, a bit of water or something like that. Or even, there are some like just herbal teas or just digestive type things, like, for example, ginger tea, or a bit of lemon in water, or anything that's just going to start that, or two things. It will help to start the digestive process. But if you have that before your meals, it can actually help to add, I suppose, to the stomach acid a little bit. And especially the apple cider vinegar will do that. Will help to add to the stomach acid and help to break some of that food down. So it's almost propping up your digestive system while you're in that sort of fight or flight. So that, from that digestive point of view, that's a really helpful thing to do. But from the stress point of view, obviously removing the extrinsic things is the best thing you can do. But if you can't do that, then it's more about finding ways to slow down. Even putting your favourite song on, going for a drive, or dancing around your house, just a way to, not while you're eating, but, just you need ways to get that stress response down. It doesn't have to be at the time that you're eating. I'm just saying in general, because if you can vent or if you can get that down, then, you're going to end up in a better place metabolically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the chewing thing has been a big one for me. Well, I always sort of, for some reason, I've had this tendency to eat really fast, and I think part of it is because I grew up in a big family, and we'd be sort of eating our meals quickly so that we could get the seconds before the others or something. And anyway,
Like the
but
puppies.
and my mum's the same. She tends to eat fast, but my dad's like the opposite. He eats so slowly, and he's always said like savor the flavor, and he sort of really tried to drill that into us. And I think when I was young, I didn't really listen very much, but over the past few years, I've been trying a lot more to focus on slower, more mindful eating, and actually chewing and tasting my food properly. And I think that plays a few roles. Like you said, one, it can help sort of activate that more sympathetic rest and digest process. Two, it obviously is the start of digestion, and I know that you do break down a lot of carbohydrates with certain enzymes in the saliva, and obviously literally the physical act of chewing your food, which is also very good for your jaw, obviously, and all of these other things. But also just tasting your food more closely, I think, could be a really big key for a lot of people, and has been for me. When you actually pay attention to what your food tastes like, you can tell whether you're eating good quality or not good quality food. You just get this intuitive sense of like, ooh, that
Yeah,
tastes
absolutely.
really good, and I want to eat more of that. Versus if you're eating, it's a lot easier to just wolf down, say a chocolate bar or something like that, because partly because it's high sugar, and you're going, oh, your brain's going, yes, this is really good high sugar, but also because if you really taste, if depending on the chocolate bar, maybe that's not the best example, but if you're eating like low quality food, like I don't know, like a Big Mac or something like that, and you really chew it, and you're like, this doesn't taste actually that good. Like, it's sort of superficially maybe tastes good, but when you actually taste it, you can sort of see why it's cheap, and and it's quote unquote unhealthy.
Yeah, you're right. And I think that that whole mindfulness, I actually, as much as I find that word strange, I think it's so important with, across the board. If you can, we seem to not prioritize slowing down enough. And
Mm,
then at the expense of that, we miss all of these, cues that we've got, as you just said, with the food, with anything, and slowing down enough. I mean, that in itself is going to help the nervous system as well, isn't it? And then, yeah,
mm,
as you say, flick it back into rest and digest.
yeah.
Um, yeah, look, it's and the what you said about the Big Mac and any of that sort of food. The problem is these days, these people spend millions of dollars, finding, the right marketing and everything that does set the brain on fire. It's in
Mm,
terms of I want that, I need it. In terms of its
mm,
advertising, its packaging, its coloring, but even the flavorings and the additives and things like that. And it is, if somebody's sort of wanting to make the switch from that over to whole foods, admittedly, I think it can be a hard process because they don't, all their taste buds are registering is that the volume turned up on flavors that aren't even real.
yeah.
And what I try and say to people is hang in there if you can for, I think it's two to 2.5 weeks. Around about, you'll have a cycle where your taste buds actually renew themselves. So if you can sit tight for a couple of weeks, you'll actually start to feel and taste foods differently.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, and I suppose I've been out of that. I mean, I've always sort of, my parents are always focused on giving us a lot of whole foods and everything, so I've been very fortunate in that respect. But I can understand how your taste buds get a certain baseline of how much flavor or how much sweetness or how much XYZ they expect to receive, and they don't receive that from real food or whole food. And um, I think, yeah, that baseline is something. I think in one sense it's, you have to get used to a new baseline of that things, all things aren't that sweet. But in another sense, I think people maybe underestimate how delicious healthy food can taste when you cook it and prepare it in the right way, and when you use the right mixtures of
Yeah,
spices and
yeah,
seasoning and various things. And I think that's probably a big thing missing these days in this society, is a lot of people are really out of touch with just how to cook or how to prepare their own food, so that they can have pride and really, because when I eat my meals now, I'm like, geez, that's delicious. Like, but it's, it's not the sort of Big Macy overwhelming, like, oh, it's like, that tastes really nice, and I know
yeah,
that it's quality food.
yeah. And well, it's interesting, yeah, what you're saying about the difference between the two and the home cooked meals. Like, and I actually brought this up. I think it was last week. What happens when you actually start to prepare your own food, and even better if you can grow it.
Mm,
The same little reward center that flies off when you get that hit of sugar or MSG or whatever it is. Um, that same thing can be replicated in a sense of achievement when you've actually, prepared a really delicious meal.
Mm,
It sort of it reframes it. If you can keep at that and sort of try that, as I said, for a couple of weeks, you'll probably start to. It may not feel like the same sense of reward to start with, but the bridge is definitely there. And if you can do that for long enough on repeat, then your brain starts to recognize that sense of reward as well. And that
mm,
one, it's a bit like the stimulants versus the clean energy. That reward of actually doing things yourself and actually doing it in a healthful way, plus all of the good nutrients that's in that food, you're only going to, you'll get to a point where that stuff over there becomes so obsolete and it's just not even
mm.
appealing anymore.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a much deeper and more sustainable reward
Yeah.
process, and yeah, it really does get you coming back for more. And I've found, especially cooking for other people or sharing my cooking with other people, is another layer on top of that. When you're feeling confident to, you've learned some really good recipes, and you're feeling pretty good with how you can recreate them consistently, and then you're like, oh cool, now I get to cook for this person or these people, and they go, oh,
Yeah.
this is yummy, and then you get that extra. Obviously you're connecting with your community, your family and friends, but you also get this extra layer of like, oh, they're enjoying the food that I cooked. And so it's
Yeah.
really
Look,
possible to
it's so
layer on that.
multifaceted, isn't it? Like
Mm,
because also, moving into things like, that reward and mental health as well. Um, you're never going to get the nutrients from the Big Mac and that sort of stuff that you need as pretty much the foundation of everything that makes you feel good eventually,
yeah.
Yes, it's a vicious, stimulant cycle, but as I said, it's a mouse wheel of sort of, it's like the caffeine, it's just not the same. When you actually experience that decent, the real nutrition and the real sort of, it's so multifaceted with how it brings positive gains to your health, as you say, with the
Mm.
community, with the actual nutrition that's doing something for you. But also that sense of reward and just, everything else that goes with it, plus delicious food. I mean,
Yeah,
let's face it, we all love food.
we all love food. But you're right. It is very multifaceted, and you could get so deep into the weeds about all of everything. But when it comes down to it, it is that simple act of preparing and cooking your own food where possible, and sharing with others is just
Yeah,
a great way to have food. And my family has this tradition. My sort of immediate family and my extended family and some family friends, which we call family dinner, which is every Thursday night we get together, whoever's available, really. Obviously, not everyone comes every week, but there's enough of a contingency that, every Thursday night we come together and like sort of each household, I suppose, cooks a meal and brings it with a certain theme each week. So last night was Moroccan, and the week before was, oh, I can't remember, but you have Vietnamese or Japanese or Italian or whatever, and it sort of force or encourages you to explore cooking with different cuisines and trying different recipes, and also sharing a lot of different people's food at once and saying, oh, that's yum, and then you get all the chats. And what we've noticed as well is that people that you usually wouldn't see otherwise, then you get to see them every week, like, or you would see them every couple of months, and now you get to see them every week. Or maybe some people don't come every week, so you get to see them every fortnight. But it's just such a cool tradition that we've sort of figured out, and I would really encourage anyone listening to see if anyone in their community or in their family or in their friendship circle to set a weekly, or wouldn't have to be weekly, but weekly or fortnightly or monthly get together where you all cook for each other, and it gives you that motivation even when you're not having those family dinners, to explore different recipes and think, oh, maybe I'll take this to the next family dinner or the next monthly gathering or something like that.
that's such a great idea. I love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, to be honest, if when you start to do that and you start to use, especially if you start using things like spices and herbs and things like that you were maybe a little bit afraid of, or it was unknown to you, then to be honest, that's all you really need when it comes to food is medicine. You know, or that you've
Mm,
just completely encompassed everything that food can be medicine toward. And
mm.
you know, eating diversely like that and going across all of these different countries and cuisines, you know, you're going to get the variety, but also so many of those beautiful, you know, international dishes and things like that. I mean, how many spices and herbs and things like
Oh,
that don't we
heaps.
eat here in Australia, like as a Western culture?
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah,
so yeah, that my mouth is actually watering right now. That sounds amazing.
yeah.
Um, and look, I
It's
think
sorry, go
I've
on.
no, sorry. What I was going to say is I think what I find in clinic is that people are just afraid of food these days because
Mm,
they hear all of these ideals or fad diets or the latest research that was keyhole research. And what I mean by that, you know, they might have looked at one parameter on something and then decided a certain food or food group was wrong or unhealthy for you. But they didn't take into, you know, because it's obviously a very singular sort of style study, they didn't take into account all of these other things. But food can be so simple. Like, and the more that I've been doing this in clinic for 20 years, and I've sort of arrived at a point maybe 10 years ago where I thought, you know what, like therapeutically, there's a few things that I can do to help people, but the baseline is just so simple. You know,
mm,
it's eat these whole foods, eat diversely, and enjoy your food. Don't be afraid of it, and get rid of the marketing. That's, you know, if anyone can take anything home from that, you know, it's really just keep it simple and don't ever think what you're eating.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
in my 20
yeah.
years of experience working with nutrition, that's my best advice. Don't overthink it.
Yeah, because and actually, if we can touch on that, because it's almost that nocebo effect of food, where once you've got this
Yeah,
belief that nocebo or placebo, where once you've got this belief that a food is bad, and then you have it, and now you're this guilty, naughty person who had that bad
yeah,
food, and then that itself, whether it's through a stress response or something else, that would mean that food would have a worse effect on your body, I would imagine, or it would influence how you process that food if you believed it was bad and believed that you were guilty for eating it.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and I think you nailed it. You know, you do obviously trigger a stress response, and I think it, there's a stress response on both sides of that because there's usually that anxiety that leads up towards it because it'll be there for some reason. Usually it's an emotional reason, but we,
Mm,
you know, that's a whole other ball game. But when you've actually eaten that food, then you've just generated a complete secondary and probably a worse, you know, as you say, that guilt and that stress response there as well. Um, Quite often with women in particular, you tend to find that that then triggers them to go and feel like they have to go and do another workout or something. You know, there's that
mhm,
compensation sort of scheme that they think that they have to work towards. And yeah, the first thing I always say to people when they're sort of in that loop is you've just got to forgive yourself. You know, you need to be more flexible with this and don't focus on that thing. You know, let's just work on the rest of it. And then we'll get to that when we need to. Because the more you focus on that one thing, you're fixating, you know, you're never going to get rid of that stress response. You're never going to get rid
mm,
of that. And yeah, you're right. It does. It completely affects your digestion. You know, everything shuts down.
yeah. And ironically, the people who are most strict and anal with what they eat and making sure that they don't eat anything else and everything. Ironically, I imagine that the stress of maintaining that diet and the stress of when you inevitably slip off actually has a worse effect than if you were
Yeah.
just, ate mostly good and mostly felt really good, and then occasionally just guilt free, just had a chocolate bar
Yeah.
or whatever, and
Yep.
had that thing and just owned it and was like, yep, I had it, I felt like it. Maybe it made me feel not so great for the afternoon, but I really felt like it, and that's okay. Or, oh, I didn't feel good that afternoon, next time I won't have it, or whatever. But it's not about being a good or bad person, or that food being good or bad. It's just
Yeah, that's
yeah,
right.
yeah, it's just part of a
It's like
broader
what you said
concept.
initially about like there's a nutrition aspect of things, and then there's, I hate to say it, but it's almost a religion to certain things, you know.
Mm,
And if
mm,
people lock on to certain dietary parameters or ideals, and whether it's, you know, they believe it's right for them or whether somebody else believes it's right for them, you know,
mm,
it's a pretty slippery slope once you get into that. I find, to have that flexibility is definitely the key to health, because I'm generalizing, but majority of the people who are so rigid with their health, if it's not for say athletic reasons or performance reasons or like bodybuilding, whatever it is, that's obviously a different ballgame. But if you're being complete, the most unhealthy people that I meet in clinic are usually the ones who walk in and go, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I've got the most perfect diet in the world. And they stick to it and they're so rigid, and you just kind of go, whoa, okay, let's work on your stress response.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, when I first started listening to a lot of podcasts about nutrition and food and understanding that it was actually a thing, and that's actually how I got into the barefoot stuff, long before I found out about the Foot Collective, or long before I guess the Foot Collective was a thing. I heard about sort of ancestral nutrition, and then that took me down the path of ancestral movement and therefore barefoot, lifestyle concepts. And yeah, I was not never to the point of like measuring out all my food and everything, but I was of that mindset of like, this food is good, this food is bad, and I can only eat this food. But I would inevitably binge really on the food that I thought was bad. And then over time, what I realized was that, especially if you are taking a broader look at all of these pillars of health, like your sleep and movement and stress, and the way you interact with your community, then you do if you're doing quite well overall with all of those things, you do have a really big buffer for food, and the human body is so resilient. And I've just come to this much more relaxed realization that I can enjoy, these sort of naughty, quote unquote naughty treat foods, or I can enjoy these treat foods here and there, especially if all those other things are on point, or at least close to on point. Whereas I think, because modern society in general encourages all of those pillars of health to be pretty weak, then people have a lot less of that buffer as well. And so if they do slip up on their sleep, or if they do have a certain food, then they maybe can tend to get knocked around a bit more than if they had a good foundation of all of those pillars.
Yeah, definitely. You're absolutely right. Yeah, that the balance. Again, it's not something I ever want people to obsess over, but having that balance is so important, and if I have somebody come in, just as an example, who is completely locked on to what they're eating, because obviously that's why they're coming to see me, they want help with their food. If they are that rigid, then I will honestly say to them, I don't care what you eat for the next week. I just want you to get out of your head and get into your body a bit more. I want you to go, I want you to either go and train or go and do some deep breathing, or just do something and forget what you're eating for a week. And when they come back, they're usually a different person, because you just need to, you can't focus on one of those things too heavily without having a detriment, to the others, if that makes sense. It's just, you're right. And making sure, if you sleep correctly, or if you're, it's all connected. Obviously, if you're well rested, if you're well rested, this is why I love the Foot Collective, by the way. I love that, it's coming from all of these angles. It excites me.
Me too.
If you're well rested, then you are a lot less likely to want the caffeine, the stimulants. You're probably a lot less likely to crave sugar and junky stimulant foods. If you move a little bit more or a little bit more effectively, then you're going to sleep better. If you eat better, then you're going to move better, et cetera, exactly. And sleep better. Yeah, it's just.
Yeah.
I always say, if in doubt, take it back to the way that nature intended. That is all you need to do. Don't worry about the colours. Don't worry about the pretty lights.
Yeah. There is a lot of distracting colors and pretty lights out there at the moment, but
yeah,
when it comes down to it, and that is, again, that's why you and I both love the I guess the approach and the concept of the Foot Collective is, it's holistic natural health, but starting at the feet. And the concept of living a barefoot lifestyle is a really good analogy for pretty much all of the other pillars of health, around, obviously evolutionarily our feet should be barefoot, or should be able to tolerate a lot of load, and to be mobile, and to be able to walk through a natural environment barefoot, and therefore, they have certain needs from an evolutionary and physiological point of view that makes sense based on our biological evolution. And the same goes for our food. Same goes for our movement as a whole. Same goes for our sleep. Same goes for our mind and the way we interact with relationships. And I do love that. I guess, this community of foot nerds, like yourself and Georgina and Andy and Braden, and obviously we've got a big community in Australia, and then also a big community all across the world. Is all of these people have their own niches. Myself and Nick are physiotherapists, and you're a naturopath, and Georgina's a massage therapist, Andy's a podiatrist, but then we're all seeing it from that point of view of, well, just me doing what I'm doing isn't enough unless someone is also looking at all of these other aspects. But
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It's such a great community. It's been amazing for me. My experience in it's been so amazing because, as you say, we've all got this the same focal points, or the same. We're all there for the same reason, but everybody's coming at it from that slightly different angle. And it is the fastest way to learn anything. It's great. I just love it. It's just everyone's just got this really beautiful sort of open mindset, and it's challenged me in ways that I didn't think it would, and I've never looked back. I love it.
out of interest, what are some of those challenges, if you're willing
Oh,
to share?
That's raw. Actually, I'll be honest. It was definitely the community aspect. So
Yeah.
and that's, look, it's a product of me sitting, in an office working one on one with people for a very long
Right.
time,
Right.
and and in some circles, in some naturopathic circles in particular, it can be quite. It's not competitive, but people sort of don't talk about protocols, and they don't share what they're doing with people a lot, and so you just kind of keep on keeping on, and the community aspect was just. I'm the first to admit, when I first signed up, it was a case of kind of going, oh no, I understand the concept of that, whatever. But actually being a part, being a part of it, it's like whenever anybody asks me about the TFC, that's always what shines in for me. And I was like, the most amazing bunch of people I've ever met.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, I know
So,
it's definitely that's definitely how I view it as well. And all the foot nerds that I've spoken to will tend to say, yeah, the best part of it is the community, and just the
yeah,
feeling of being a part of something that's greater than just yourself. I think that's the genius of the collective aspect of it. Is, there could be all these people who are sort of interested in barefoot stuff, but once you create a collective of all these people that can share information, then it becomes a lot more powerful, and you feel like you've got this, you're part of a bigger direction and a bigger
yeah.
purpose.
Look, in terms of like an information think tank, I think it's brilliant because
Mm,
the whole concept. I mean, my work has always been very much between movement and food and a lot of these pillars, but to actually get you guys involved in my head with and you're coming from that position where you're professionals in the movement,
mm.
it's really just it's capitalized on any information that I thought I ever had. It's this beautiful constant dynamic. Where it's forever evolving, and I think we're all growing a lot together. Like even the people who are not practitioners, the
Yeah.
experience that they bring to the whole thing. I just love it. It's so
Yeah,
good.
yeah. Everyone has their own unique experience, and
Yeah,
it's all part of it. And I think that's why I'm really excited to be doing these podcasts with you, and to be getting more of the foot nerds on, because having these chats, well, one, from a selfish point of view, I just really like chatting with you guys and picking your brains on your expertise and everything, and also giving, I guess, the outside community, the rest of the TFC community, an insight into what we're doing and where we're coming from, and the podcast has been such a rewarding sort of project in that sense. And also, I'm just really looking forward to getting down and visiting you guys in a couple of weeks.
I can't wait.
It's coming up. And so we all get to hang out in person, and we'll get a few more podcasts going, and it's gonna be a good time.
I think if we can, if together we can all just start to deconstruct all of the noise that's out there for people, and actually just get them back to what really matters. Then in terms of healing, you can't really do much better than that. In terms of actually being the most healthful person that you can be.
For sure.
That is it.
Yeah, because our body is a healing machine, and if you give it the right things, if you give it sort of the simple things that it needs, then you'll become a healing and energetic machine.
Well, yeah. Look, people used to laugh at me when I would say that, because it is. Well, once upon a time, it was only a naturopathic principle, and I know that we all are aware of that now. But when you say that the body can heal itself, I don't think people realise that we've got that cell replication constantly. When you cut yourself, it heals. Like the rest of the body can do that too. You're laying down new things, and if you've got that choice between the hamburger and the good quality food, or the stress response, or dealing with things in the right way, in the healthful way, the rest, the recovery, then you're only going to capitalise when those cells and things start to reproduce and start to renew themselves. They're going to do it in the right way. You can actually, I can't remember how much time it actually takes for everything to reprogram into an entirely new body. But it's actually not that long in the scheme of things. Yeah, it's not
7
that
years
long.
Not really. Yeah, I think technically every 7 years, obviously it all happens gradually, but not a single cell in our body is the same 7 years later, or not the same as it was 7 years earlier. So that's pretty crazy.
Well, it is, and I think if people sort of have that sort of time frame in mind and just go, look, it's not going to happen overnight. We're not dealing with a drug that suppresses the symptom. You're in it for the long haul, but just make small changes, and every day you'll get better.
Yeah, and then you do really start to feel the difference those changes are making, and then it becomes that becomes addictive in its own right, or not addictive, but it becomes
it does. Endorphins are amazing.
yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. Agreed.
That's probably a good spot to leave it. I know we're coming up on time. There's a bunch of other topics that would be cool to go through, but I reckon they would all make sense into another follow-up episode if you're keen.
Sure.
It'd be great to get one in person sometime as well. So thank you so much for coming on again and sharing your knowledge, and we'll link anything that we talked about in the show notes. I guess one thing to just before we sign off is just where people can find you, anything that you're working on or want people to check out.
Yeah, sure. Look, best way to find it, my actual clinic work is Natural Body Lab. So I am a practitioner down here in Melbourne, but I'm doing everything virtually now. So I do have clients interstate as well as overseas. So on Instagram, it's literally at Natural Body Lab. And if you follow through that, like I do actually teach people about, wild foods and herbs and things like that. But if you jump onto the clinic pages, then there's actually some links into that as well. So,
Sweet.
That's me.
Yeah. The wild medicine and stuff is definitely something I want to get into in the next podcast. So
it's a lot of fun. I'm kind of hoping if we can get out for a bit of a hike when you guys get down, and it might still be mushroom season.
Oh, let's do it. Sounds good.
No worries.
All right. Thanks so much, Claire.
Thanks, James. Bye.